Dickheads! We have a special pink laser beam of truth beaming from all over the West Coast to your brain hole tonight. Joining us for this special Hugo Award winners of the 60s episode on A Canticle for Leibowitz, joining us is author Brian Evenson.
Hi.
And librarian Ian Duncanson, also a.k.a. Brewdog. Some of you might know as that I turned him into a character in my novel Vegan Revolution with Zombies. So, and Ian's a youth librarian in Beaverton, Oregon. So,
yes.
So welcome, guys. And I just wanted to start off with what was your history with Canticle for Leibowitz? When did you read it, and how were you introduced to it? Brian, you want to go first?
Sure, absolutely. I came across it by accident. I think it was a book my parents were reading and talking about when I was like 14 or 15, and I picked it up, read it, and really liked it at the time. And then hadn't read it for years, and then maybe a year and a half ago, reread it and really loved it. It held up really well for me.
Yeah, Ian, what's your history with Canticle for Leibowitz?
Well, I just kind of heard about it for years as a classic of science fiction, and I think my dad actually had it on his shelf, but I was always reaching for the Lovecraft or something like that, Kurt Vonnegut first. But yeah, my dad definitely had a copy, and so I always wanted to read it. My dad was really kind of obsessed with like nuclear weapons and the history of the development of them. And so he had a lot of books like this. And then, once you invited me to do the podcast, I thought it was just as good as an excuse as any to finally read it.
Right, and for me, this is my first time reading it. Canticle for Leibowitz has been a book that I've just known that I should read, or as one was on my list for forever and just didn't get to. And then once we started doing this series, obviously I had to read it. And I thought of you, Ian, because I knew you'd been talking about it. And Brian, I wanted somebody who had a longer history with it, too.
Uh-huh.
So since Ian and I both just read this for the first time in the last month or two. So anyways, this book was originally written throughout the 50s. It was a fix-up novel that contained 3 novellas. And Walter Miller had always planned for it to be a novel, but he didn't think he could publish it as an entire novel by itself. As the market was in the 50s, most books had to be serialized. This was very common. Books as famous as Foundation, Dune, all of those, all started as serials in the magazines. And that was the case for A Canticle for Leibowitz. And it wasn't until 1959 that he put them all 3 novellas together, and in 1960 it was nominated for the Hugo, and it won. Obviously, that's why we're doing it. So I just, it's really interesting. I think the context of, this book was written in 1959, basically, and it really holds up today. I don't know. How did you guys feel about how it held up? Because I think it holds up amazing.
I totally agree. I mean, I was surprised that it, there's other books that I've reread later that I loved when I was a kid, and they just did not hold up, or the world had changed a lot. This one really feels to me like it holds up really well, and I found it just as good and just as interesting as when I first read it. It still feels really relevant in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Ian, did you feel this was dated at all, or when you read it?
Well, actually, I was telling Brian before while we were working out our technical difficulties that I thought this book held up a lot better than some of the other 1950s sci-fi that I've read, and in some ways, kind of eerily prescient. But yeah, I didn't think it seemed that dated at all. It didn't have a lot of female characters. I did notice that, but also, it was set among monks, so you can kind of get away with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so this book, I think, unlike when we discussed the winners of the Hugo in many years, a lot of the discussion is, I can't believe this book won over this, right? And but if you look at the nominees this year, and it's somewhat of a strong category, for this year, Canticle for Leibowitz won. The other nominees were The High Crusade by Paul Anderson, who's a very respected science fiction writer. Rogue Moon by Algis Bundries. I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
So I don't know anything about that one. Death World by Harry Harrison, which I have read.
Uh-huh.
Kind of a bonkers,
Yeah.
kind of space opera thing. And then probably the biggest competition that this book had this year was Venus Plus X by Theodore Sturgeon, which I read probably 25 years ago, so my memories on it was really hazy, and I don't know how it would hold up today because the book is very much, Venus Plus X is very much about a genderless society, and the politics, from my memory, were pretty good, although I don't know, that was 25 years ago that I read it.
Yeah.
And, but one of the things that in researching this is I realized that I really want to go back and read Venus Plus X. But from what I read, that this was a 2-horse race that year. That the voting was very close between Venus Plus X and Canticle for Leibowitz, but Leibowitz pulled ahead. And the Toastmaster that year was Harlan Ellison.
Oh wow!
So Harlan gave out this award, one of the things that's really interesting too about this. The giving of this award is when you look down the years, you see how the Toastmasters who kind of handed it out. One of the things that makes me sad is that we don't have audio of the acceptance speeches, or when I'd love to hear what Harlan had to say about.
Yeah.
So, anyways, we'll get into the writing and publication history, and then we'll just kind of freeform a little bit more. But Walter Miller only wrote one novel during his lifetime, and that was A Canticle for Leibowitz. His entire output was 41 short stories, including the 3 that eventually became this book, and it was all between January 1951 and August 57 is when all of those were written. And that's, according to Wikipedia, that was the exact months. I don't know how they know that those were the exact months that he was writing. But Miller was a very interesting person. During World War II, he served as a part of a bomber crew, which a lot of authors that we read from this era did serve in World War II. I know Richard Matheson also served on a bombing crew, and Kurt Vonnegut.
Right.
Yeah.
Very famous.
Famously, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And much like Vonnegut was inspired by the bombing of Dresden to write Slaughterhouse-Five, Canticle for Leibowitz was very inspired by Miller being part of the bombing crew that helped destroy the 6th century Roman Catholic monastery at Monte Cassino, Italy, that was founded by Saint Benedict. And this experience was what inspired him to write the original short story Canticle for Leibowitz, which is the first of the 3 novellas in this book. And so I think his fascination with the order of monks and the living as monks came from his experience of being a part of the bombing campaign. He talked about it in the few interviews that he gave about Canticle for Leibowitz, and there are not a lot of interviews. So, I mean, that's one thing. I mean, like when I'm reading when we're doing the research for a lot of the PKD books, there's plenty of interviews with PKD. I mean, they contradict each other all the time, but there's plenty of interviews out there. And so the second novella was originally called "And the Light is Risen," and that was published also in. These short stories were published in fantasy and science fiction, which is really important when you realize who his editor was. And this is a guy we talk about all the time on Dickheads. Shout out to Tony Boucher. Anthony Boucher is one of the most important editors of the 50s and 60s in science fiction, and he's often a Toastmaster for this award too over the course of the 60s. But Tony Boucher is known for careful writing and characterization, and being a really great steward of, also, most importantly, all the ideas that John W. Campbell didn't want shit to do with, right? And I think, for example, this is a story that John W. Campbell wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole, and it's really important that we had Tony Boucher here to pick up a lot of these stories. And we can talk about his influence a little bit more when we get done with the writing and publication. But we do have a quote from Miller where he said, "Only after I had written the first two and was working on the third did it dawn on me that this was a novel." So he did write the first two as a short story, but the third was thematically connected. He knew he was writing a novel when he wrote the third one. And I wonder how, I don't know, Brian, as a writer, how do you feel that, do you think that that makes sense when you consider the last novel? Does it feel like it's more directly connected?
Yeah, what do you think? I mean, I hadn't thought about, I hadn't realized that was the history of it, but I mean, there's such a gap between all the novels, and that you have a 600-year gap between the three, that I always have just felt like, it kind of wraps things up nicely, but it also it's its own creature at the same time. That's one thing I really like about that book, is just the amount of time it really covers and crosses.
As a first-time reader, I can say that and not having known how it was written either, I can say that I didn't notice it either. Like it felt like it just crossed 3 time periods pretty seamlessly. Mm-hmm. I thought it felt all connected.
Yeah. Right.
And and it's really interesting too, because if you think about it, he had more of the idea of what the theme was going to be when he was pulling it together, obviously, with the third one, but I'm much like Ian. I did not know that it was a fix-up novel. I did not know that they were written separately, so I just believed that they were conceived all together. But one of the things that's, we'll get more into the actual, the feeling of the story, but so the last thing for the publishing history is that Canticle for Leibowitz was the only novel that Miller published during his lifetime. Mm-hmm. Miller did not, he changed the titles of each of the novellas with the once he knew that they were going to be a novel, with the what was it, the Fiat
Homo is the first one.
Homo, Fiat Lux, and Fiat Volan. Oh God, I'm so terrible at pronouncing things. Volantuous Tana. So Tua, yeah. So he didn't come up with those names until he put it all together. Now, he did do significant revisions, so it is a fix-up novel, but I think that if you were to go back to the fantasy and science fiction original short stories, they'd probably be slightly different. Because he definitely did that. And he said his exact words were that these revisions affected the religious and reoccurrence themes of the stories, improving it from the magazine versions. So, he definitely tied the themes together a little bit better once he knew it was going to be a novel. And so what's really interesting now is I did put a little thought into, I did think about trying to track down the original short story versions, but then I decided I just wanted to leave the experience as having read the novel as it was intended when he wrote it. Also because we're doing this as talking about the Hugo winners. The short stories did not win the Hugo. The novel won the Hugo, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where I felt on that. So, all right. So let's get into and this is where I will talk less, I promise. How you felt about each of the novels. Let's just start off with the first one and the setting. What really worked for me is I went into this novel cold. I knew that it was post-apocalyptic, but I had no idea the grand scope of the story and how how far this story would go over the number of years. And for me, it was a really cool reveal when the character in the first story went down into the shelter, I just assumed the war had just happened. And there's a line where he just randomly lets go. He says something about these books haven't been read in 600 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a really great reveal for me. And that, to me, was one of my favorite moments of the first novel. Let's start with you, Brian. What were your feelings? What are your feelings on this first part?
Right. I mean, I think he's really economical in terms of how he kind of conveys his world and gets across information about what's going on in terms of the post-apocalyptic setting and things like that. And so for me, the thing that often in bad post-apocalyptic novels, they just kind of over-explain. And here he's just very precise, I think, in terms of what he gives you and how much he gives you and kind of making it work. That works for me really well. I think the reveal about what the documents are that they've found as well is really amazing. I think there's a kind of sharp sense of humor, fairly black humor kind of throughout too, which I like a lot. And then I think also he's also really good just in terms of thinking about religious structures and how they kind of function and work. And it's really interesting to have this model of a religious structure that's developed in a way that we can see where the misinterpretations are and really where it's failed to really acknowledge what was actually there. And it's interesting for me to kind of think about that as a way, reading that back into kind of earlier times. But yeah, I think it's an interesting section. It's works really well, and I think that you're right. I think what happens when you're reading this, especially that first book, you think, oh, I've read the first section, now there's going to be a second section, it's going to happen right after. And then it doesn't. And so you have these moments in all three sections where you're kind of reorienting yourself and figuring out what happened in 600 years and how's the world changed.
Well, and it's a really bold choice to, kind of do away with a standard narrative movement of time, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't have a kind of central character exactly in the same way, even though, characters that appear in the first are kind of referred to in later ones. But yeah, so it has, structurally it's different than we usually think of a novel as being.
Mm-hmm. So Ian, what were your feelings when you first read this? Did you realize that it was going to be such a time-spanning story, or how quickly did that occur for you?
No, I didn't realize that, and then I kind of liked at the beginning, like the way there was a sort of a mystery about he's down here in this bomb shelter trying to figure out finding documents, and I thought it was really interesting to see him kind of unravel like why the Leibowitz documents were so important to this order. And then also, I actually kind of went in expecting it to be more of a kind of deeply religious novel, and it wasn't really at all. Like, just a presentation of what a religious order might be like after the apocalypse. So I enjoyed that too.
Right. So here's one of my favorite parts from Fiat Homo. Now after 6 centuries of darkness, the monks still preserved this memorabilia, studied it, copied it, recopied it, and patiently waited. At the beginning, in the time of Leibowitz, it had been hoped, even anticipated as probable, that the 4th or 5th generation would begin to want its heritage back. But the monks of the earliest days had not counted on the human ability to generate new cultural inheritance in a couple of generations if an old one is utterly destroyed, to generate it by virtue of lawgivers and prophets, geniuses or maniacs, through a Moses or through a Hitler, or an ignorant but tyrannical grandfather. A cultural inheritance may be acquired between dusk and dawn, and many have been so acquired. But the new culture was an inheritance of darkness. Wow! Because here's what he's doing is, I mean, the writing is very pretty. It's really great prose.
Yeah.
But in a way, he's breaking one of the cardinal rules of writing where, the show don't tell thing. He's definitely telling you the point, but it's so well done. I think he gets away with it, throughout this book. But I don't know. How do you guys feel about how the themes are conveyed this early in the novel, Brian?
I do think he gets away with that, and it is, as you say, it's a little bit, it's more direct than most writers would do. But also, I think that kind of goes with the kind of religious, context as well. That's one of the reasons he kind of gets away with it. But it's also like, for me, it's like I think when you start reading it, you think, oh, this is going to be a story about kind of monks in the future, and it is. But it's also like, if this is a Catholic order of monks who have a saint named Leibowitz,
yeah.
And so there's this kind of amazing kind of, kind of Jewish center of what's going on for them, and it just kind of really, it both kind of is referring back to the way in which Christ was the King of the Jews, but also kind of questioning the whole way in which the Catholic Church works, I think.
Yeah, I love the contradictions in it throughout. The Leibowitz thing caught me too.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of those contradictions. That's one of the things that makes it, I think, such a fun read and works so well.
Well, and I can only say, I have, I grew up in a primarily Jewish family, and I don't know anything about Catholicism. So I really don't know how this book reads for a Catholic, but I'm told that Catholics really, really dig this book.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a positive review on a Catholic website that I found too.
Yeah.
So, I think I don't think the Catholics seem to really connect to this book, and I don't pretend to understand why. I can't really comment on that, but I know that Miller considered himself a Catholic. Well, throughout it.
Yeah. Well, he's Catholic in the way that someone like Flannery O'Connor is Catholic, where there's a pretty complex relationship to the Catholicism, which I think of as real and intense. And I'm not at all questioning his faith as a Catholic, but I just think it's he's not Catholic in the way that in a simple way, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't find the book to be to be really pushing a religious agenda.
No, not at all.
I like that too, and I kind of thought just going into it, given the title of it and given the fact that it was from the 50s, that it was going to have more of a religious agenda to it. So it was a nice surprise that it didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's totally true. So the second part, Fiat Lux, we get into more of what the order taking the links to keep St. Leibowitz's papers alive, and what's going into that. One of my favorite parts I'm reading for those of you that are on the YouTube version of this, I got this really cool Greg Press edition of Canticle for Leibowitz from 1980, and it has this hilarious drawing of a monk with a nuclear mushroom cloud behind him and a spaceship. And it has an introduction, by the way, by Norman Spinrad. So, and Norman Spinrad's mostly what he was talking about is how amazing of a thing that Canticle for Leibowitz was a work of somebody, that most science fiction masterworks are inside a bibliography from, greats like Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Ursula Le Guin, that have entire careers, to look back on, and how the Canticle is this like singular lightning bolt from this author. But anyways, back to Fiat Lux. I love this part on my edition. It's page 206. Tomorrow a new prince shall rule. Men of understanding, men of science shall stand behind his throne, and the universe will come to know his might. His name is truth. His empire shall encompass the earth, and the mastery of man over earth shall be renewed. A century from now, men will fly through the air in mechanical birds. Metal carriages will race along the roads of man-made stone. There will be buildings of 30 stories, ships that will go under the sea, and machines to perform all works. So I really love that he didn't have technology just coming back right away. That it was this process that millennia is passing, that hundreds of years are going on, and even though this part of the novella is on the dawn of this new age, I like that he gave technology the space, right, to grow.
Yep.
I don't know. Brian? How did you feel about this second part?
Yeah, I like the second part. Strikes me as a kind of like conflict between old ideas and new ideas, and it's a lot about power struggles and a lot about the relationship of the monastery to kind of the larger world and where that seems to be going, and that's really intriguing to me. I mean, I think that's an area that science fiction is often dealing in. I mean, this notion of two societies or parts of a society kind of clashing up against one another, but it does it in a really interesting way. And there is throughout, I think what feels the most kind of 60-ish about this book to me is just that thread of nuclear destruction, both past and future, that kind of hangs over the book.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I love the kind of conversations in the middle part where they're trying to figure out what to do with the artifacts and refusing to let them be moved and things like that, and then where that all goes.
I like that they call them memorabilia too.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a neat thing. Ian, how did you feel about this second part?
I think the second part might have actually been my favorite part because I loved all of the sort of tension within the monastery, and then also the overall political tension in the world as a whole too.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's really a testament to this novel that here's this huge part that's just about a bunch of monks in a monastery, and to me, this book was never boring. This book never dragged for me. I've seen a couple reviews where people are like, whoa, this is some slow-paced stuff, and I'm just like, I did not get that at all.
Yeah, I didn't think it was slow-paced.
No, me neither.
I wasn't bored.
No.
Yeah, it worked for me throughout, and but then we shoot ahead in time with the third part, which I already showed that I'm not good at pronouncing. Fiat voluntunis tua. All right. If Anthony was here, he'd be laughing at me. But this last part is definitely the most science fiction of the three. This is the most traditional science fiction. And it was funny because I'm currently rewatching all of Battlestar Galactica right now. And so I can't help but notice that it has the exact same theme with the repeating of, what has happened will happen again kind of thing that is such a huge part of the theme of the new Battlestar Galactica. And I almost wonder if any of the writers there were a fan of Canticle for Leibowitz. It's very possible because it is such a popular science fiction novel over time.
Mm-hmm.
But this part, this is where he gets a little bit more experimental. He has entire sections where it's just, reporters and defense ministers, quotes, and it comes straight out of news conferences and things like that. And so the writing is very different, but it's definitely where, as we know, because now we know how he wrote it, that he was tying the themes together. And I think, this part is where, he's obviously spelling it out a little bit more, but for me, I did like the second part, but for me as a science fiction fan, I definitely loved everything that was going on in this third part. I don't know. Let's start with you, Brian. Like, how did you feel about the third act of this book?
Well, I like it, and I think it kind of brings everything together in an interesting way. I do think that the third act doesn't. I've been thinking a lot about the fact these were published separately, and I could see each of those first two parts kind of as separate things that I could read, and the third one really does gain a lot from having the other parts there. So it both nicely wraps things up. It seems a little more dependent on it. Going back to Battlestar Galactica, I do think one of the writers for Battlestar Galactica was in fact a Mormon. There's a lot of weird Mormon references, so I think there's a religious thing, and it may just be analogous, but it may also be that he was a fan of Canticle for Leibowitz.
Well, I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, they definitely had the same theme of the what will happen again was basically the last scene of the whole show, and was controversial too because a lot of people didn't like that.
Yeah.
I personally
fairly grim ending in the novel too, and in a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah, and Ian, when you got to this last part, did you expect it to go to space? Because I didn't.
No, I didn't expect it to go to space, and I appreciated that after like the first two parts sort of have like these kind of like bleak endings a little bit, and I appreciated that this one had some hope at the end, which is I feel like it's more rare for post-apocalyptic works nowadays to have a glimmer of hope. I think it's like the Mad Max Road Warrior effect.
Yeah.
Sort of thing.
Well, it's kind of a glimmer, but you also think, well, they're just going to go somewhere else and repeat the whole thing over again.
Yeah, it kind of leaves it open, right?
It does leave it open for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're like loading the children on the spaceship, and so it seemed hopeful, but
well, that was a theme that you just brought up, Ian, was a big in the 50s for Philip K. Dick. Was every book ended with "We're going to go to the frontier and everything's going to be amazing."
Yeah.
And like almost every single book of Dick's in the 50s ended with like, everything will be great when we get to the colonies, right? And but I do that is really a good point, Ian, is that the hope at the end is something that also I didn't expect to have when I was coming towards the end of this book. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially the first part in this book. I remember, like at the end of the first part. I won't give any spoilers, but the end of that kind of is like it was so sudden.
We're spoiling.
So no, it's interesting because I think my favorite part is that first part because for various reasons, and Ian's is the second, and yours is the third.
Yeah, that is kind of funny how that worked out.
Yeah, well, there's something for everyone in this book, I guess.
Yeah, I liked all the political intrigue in the second one.
Yeah, that stuff is great, I think.
Yeah, and the tension in the monastery too, when they're calling each other heathens. And
yeah.
Yeah, well, and I'm really interested in how the three parts work differently for each of us. I do think that's really funny. I definitely liked all of it altogether. I think from top to bottom it's an incredible book, but I think the way it can hit people in different ways just because it is three fundamentally different stories that work together.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's really cool. So let's get into a little bit more about the reaction and then we'll talk about the themes. Because I'm interested in your opinions on these different reviews that came out over time and how you feel about them. At the time that the book was released, the New Yorker referred to this book as referred to Miller as a dull, ashy writer guilty of heavyweight irony.
Yeah, that's rough.
Whew. And then I'll read a couple more, and then we'll just talk about. I'll get your take on how these people felt about things. Time magazine said, Miller proves himself chillingly effective at communicating a kind of post-human lunar landscape of disaster, but dubbed it into. And then they called it. I'm sorry, I messed up the quote. But then they said it was intellectually lightweight. Which is interesting that they said. But then a decade...
I don't think I'd call it that.
No.
But then a decade later, Time magazine had a different reviewer who called it an extraordinary novel, even by literary standards, which have flourished by word of mouth for a dozen years. So Time Magazine has a 1 negative review and 1 positive review.
I'm going to wait for the 3rd review to break the tie.
Right.
So it got kind of reevaluated.
Oh, yeah. Certainly. At the time, Floyd Gale of Galaxy Magazine said it has many passages of remarkable power and deserves the widest possible audience. And perhaps my favorite review, in 1978, Carl Sagan listed Canticle for Leibowitz among the stories that are so... he said, quote, "This story is so tautly constructed, so rich in accommodating details of unfamiliar society, that they swept me along before I even had a chance to be critical." So those are some of the reviews that were out there. I have a hard time believing that somebody thought, even at the beginning, the first time that they read this, that it was intellectually... just no. I can't see that at all.
Yeah.
But, so I guess, now that we've kind of talked about, like, the whole thing, let me start with Ian. Your thoughts as a whole piece, a Canticle for Leibowitz, all 3 parts, as a whole novel, how do you feel about this novel?
Well, I really, liked it overall, and I thought it earns its, I think, place in sci-fi, in the pantheon of sci-fi classics, if you will. I didn't like I was saying earlier, I didn't find it as dated, other than what Brian said about the most 1960s thing being the threat of thermonuclear annihilation. But maybe it wasn't until after stuff like Dr. Strangelove had come out and movies like that people kind of took it more seriously, and there was more apocalyptic literature coming out. But yeah, overall I thought it was really good. I found the prose to be a little bit dense, but not in a bad way. It just it made me read it more carefully and kind of slow down a little bit, and I had to take breaks at certain points to make sure I was picking it up, comprehending as much as I could. But yeah, I did not find it, intellectually weak at all.
Mm-hmm. Brian, Canticle for Leibowitz is a whole piece.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think it's intellectually weak. I mean, it is funny that certain books just, don't quite connect with people originally, or certain people anyway. I kind of see that argument as kind of literary snobism.
Yeah.
And so that it's significant that the reviewer from Galaxy really gets it. And then it takes the literary establishment, time and 10 years to catch up, or 12 years, whatever you said it was. I think it really works well overall, and I do agree it holds up really well, and is pretty remarkable as a novel. And I think it's more complex than the original reviewers were really thinking about. I do agree that some of the language is ornate sometimes, but I didn't find that problematic or overly. So
yeah, well, and I think part of it is that it has these really intense themes, which I want to talk a little bit about too. And for a novel that was written by an author who doesn't have a bibliography that we can research. Yeah. There was an academic named David Samuelson he wrote his dissertation at DePauw in 1969 on Canticle for Leibowitz, and he went through and researched all the short stories that Miller wrote in his entire short career. And it's a really interesting essay. You can find it online if you look up David Samuelson, Canticle for Leibowitz. I found the whole essay, and I think he talked a lot about the cyclical theme was something that Miller had written about many times before. And so he has this quote: "The cyclical theme of technological progress and regress is the foundation stone on which Canticle for Leibowitz is built, and is present in much of Miller's early writing too. 2 short stories foretell the complete collapse of our civilization or race. 2 concern political stalemates in which technological progress is at least slowed, and 5 more of his stories include directly the theme of rebuilding society after the collapse of technology. So these were themes that he was working on. And I think this one won the Hugo, right? And was addressing these issues, but I don't really know of a book that did the recurring theme before this. And I'm not even sure if I know one that did it as well after either. Mm-hmm. Except for, obviously we talked about, I'm not saying Battlestar Galactica did it as well. It didn't. But it did the same theme. I'm just wondering, have you seen this? Have either of you seen this theme before in science fiction?
Not much. I'm trying to think if there are instances, and really, I think what happens is you kind of move from focusing on a particular character to focusing on just the whole development of a society, and that's a pretty complicated thing to pull off. I can't think of any other good example of it. I think there are people who've done it, but not really good examples of it.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I don't know how you feel about this, Brian, but as a writer, I can't imagine structuring a novel with this many themes, but not even having a main protagonist.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of a magic trick.
Yeah.
Leibowitz is a MacGuffin who's throughout the whole thing, but really, that's the connective tissue is these papers, not really a character.
Right.
Yeah. And that's, I can't think of any other books that did that either, really successfully anyways. But
yeah.
And I don't know, as far as the, Ian, I don't know how you feel about the themes and the technology. Are you? Obviously, you would be interested in checking out some of his short stories. I know I want to. When I hear this list of he did this 5 times, he did this 4 times.
Yeah,
it really makes me want to seek out those other short stories. I don't know. Did you feel the same way?
Yeah. I definitely read more about him. I actually thought this was the only thing he'd ever done. Like, I didn't realize he had other stories, too.
Yeah, I don't know if he has a collection out.
Yeah. I'm going to have to look at Powell's or something.
But another quote from the very long essay by Donaldson, for the technophilic Miller, who was an engineer, unlike technophobic C.S. Lewis, the direct opposition of science and religion won't do, at least if not the means of downgrading science and technology. They represent for him the best that we can do today and in the foreseeable future. When it comes to knowledge and concrete achievement, a Canticle for Leibowitz, however, religion suggests a kind of wisdom, traditional, irrational, humane, which knowledge alone cannot reach. And basically what he's saying is that he didn't see religion and technology as being, against, that they couldn't work together.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely got that from this book too. That he showed them intermingling.
Yeah. And for me, I grew up with a father who's a physicist and who also was Mormon, and so I had this weird common. I saw a lot of people who could balance those things together in a way that was effective.
But that's really interesting because, I think people would not. I didn't know that, Brian, that your father was a physicist. That's really cool.
Yeah, he was the one who turned me on to all sorts of science fiction, and I think it's I think it has to do with his interest in science and physical world.
And you said this was on his shelf, right? This book.
Yeah, both him and my mom read it, and I just remember them talking about it, and it was on the shelf, and I had they had a little paperback copy of it, and I just picked it up and read it.
That's really cool.
I liked it a lot, yeah. It was kind of in that period where, when you're a certain age, you're a kid, and it's fun to read things that people think are probably too hard for you.
Yeah, I did that too.
Yeah, I think that's common for us, like, who are very serious nerds about all this stuff.
Yeah.
I thought it was great, and the last two books that I read for the Hugo series before this one, I really did not like, so it was really exciting to read this one, and thinking of this within the context of not just as an individual book, but as a piece of the Hugos in the 60s. If you look at the books that were winning around this time, this was the book that won the year after Starship Troopers.
Yeah.
So think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Robert Heinlein wrote Starship Troopers because he was mad when he saw an anti-nuclear ad in the newspaper, and it pissed him off so bad that he in a fury, wrote Starship Troopers.
Yeah.
This is kind of the polar opposite.
Yeah.
And they won back-to-back years.
Right.
And, it's really interesting because we see a lot of, now it seems like with the whole controversy with the sad puppies and those things, that they try to make out this world that the science fiction is very singular in the way that we view politics. And I think it's really cool to look at, those two books being back to back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. I like thinking of it as a corrective to how the award was given the year before.
Right. For real. And if you look at, this was a very strong category for a while, for a couple years. And that's one of the reasons why I think Fritz Lieber's The Wanderer and was such a painful one for people to accept, because in the years right before it, you had Stranger in a Strange Land, Starship Troopers, Canticle for Leibowitz, and Man in the High Castle.
Yeah.
All in this block together that won the award. And I think in this early block in the 60s, I don't know how you guys feel, but to me, Canticle for Leibowitz is the strongest of that bunch, even over Man in the High Castle.
I agree with that. I think.
Yeah, I can agree with that too. Yeah, I mean, I love Man in the High Castle too, but
me too.
But I think if we're talking doing a critical debate, I think Canticle for Leibowitz would probably win over, just on strength of writings, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think the thing about that makes those books are kind of tangentially connected in a sense thematically is that, and a lot of people forget because they want to view Man in the High Castle as just oh, look, it's scary, it's Nazis, and they took over. But really the theme of Man in the High Castle is the untrustworthiness of history.
Yeah.
Right? And how history is an alternate reality that perhaps we travel in and out of to a degree based on our perceptions.
Yeah.
That's a huge part of what was going on with Man in the High Castle. So I think the scope of history is the two things that connect Man in the High Castle and Canticle for Leibowitz.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciate on that level. Now, when we get into the whole 60s, I will say, spoiler alert for the series, I don't know when we're going to release this one in order of the series, but I still think Stand on Zanzibar is the best science fiction novel of the 60s.
I haven't read it yet.
Yeah.
Still have that.
I read that for this series already this year. It was the 1969 winner, and I definitely, as much as I love Canticle for Leibowitz, and I did really think long and hard, which is better, Stand on Zanzibar or Canticle for Leibowitz, and personally, I went with Stand on Zanzibar. I think is slightly better. Just the predictive nature of it is something. But the last thing I want to talk about before, and this is where I really, hope you guys will go off and I'll kind of let you guys talk this one out, is I found it interesting when I saw a lot of there's a lot of people that were doing Hugo retrospectives. There was one in The Guardian, and I really found the guy's take on Canticle for Leibowitz, like his article about The Wanderer, Fritz Lieber, was hilarious, and I agreed with every word of it. But his take on this one, I couldn't get. His name is Sam Jordanson, and he said, the sleight of hand satirized by Michael Chabon he was talking about Michael Chabon who did an essay about The Road by Cormac McCarthy.
Mm-hmm.
And he said in his excellent essay, instead of blackening McCarthy's good name with a science fiction brand to words such as parable or fable, he was talking about how people won't even consider The Road by Cormac McCarthy science fiction. And then he said, thus by separating McCarthy from science fiction roots, these reviewers do him and his predecessors a disservice. Is the Road and its predecessor, is The Road really so very separate from John Christopher's Death of Grass, John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids, or On the Beach, or Boris Strutsky's, I'm terrible with names, Stalker? Has it really propelled them far beyond by McCarthy's deathless prose? More to the point, is it any better than William Miller Jr.'s Canticle for Leibowitz?
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that The Road is literature, but Canticle for Leibowitz isn't, that it's considered science fiction in the past, I don't know. I think Canticle for Leibowitz is every bit as much literature as The Road or On the Beach or Alas Babylon, and I think it needs to be reassessed in the more highbrow versions of this post-apocalyptic fiction that came out in the 50s. Ian, what do you think?
Well, I mean, you're talking to a librarian, so I find value in almost anything. I mean, I do use I read YA literature, and I think there's value in that. I think, but yeah, the literary snobbery towards sci-fi. I mean, it still goes on today. I mean, so I would agree with his assessment that it should be evaluated higher. I mean, but I always thought that this was more of a classic among not just science fiction fans, but people outside of that, like you were saying, like Catholics seem to really like it. So I mean, I do think there's probably more of an audience out there for it, other than just diehard sci-fi fans like us.
So Ian, is this a book that you're going to be recommending as a library? I know you mostly do youth librarian stuff, or at least you used to. Is this one that you're going to start trying to put in the hands of? No, definitely. I definitely recommend it to people looking for classic sci-fi or post-apocalyptic literature. But I'm not at all a literary snob like the New Yorker guy from the 50s, or the quote you read us earlier. I mean, like I said, I try to find value in anything, and so I mean, if I've got someone in front of me and I'm trying to recommend books to them, and I think that they might like this book based on what they're looking for, what they said they read before, I would totally recommend it in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. Brian, how do you think this fits into that classier, quote unquote, classier genre of post-apocalyptic fiction?
Well, I think it's better than a lot of the quote-unquote classier.
Yeah.
There's that. But I do think, it's a tricky thing, and I think what happens sometimes is that just people's ideas of the way in which genre works get kind of outdated. And so, McCarthy kind of objected when he was nominated for a science fiction prize, and didn't want to be called science fiction. I think asked to have his name removed from consideration, his book removed from consideration. I just think he's just an old dude. And I think for him...
I like him, much respect. But
I love Cormac McCarthy, and I did the address for the Cormac McCarthy Society a couple of years ago. I'm a super big fan of his work, but I also think he doesn't understand how our sense of genre has changed over the years. He's a great writer, but he also, that kind of knee-jerk reaction against science fiction is not productive, not good for him necessarily. And it is I do see post-apocalyptic work on both sides of the literature and genre divide as really operating well together and having a lot to say to one another. So it would be great if more people read Miller, and people on the literary side especially read him. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Dickheads podcast that Philip K. Dick didn't get. recognition until after, long after he was gone either.
Yeah.
People finally waking up to him.
Right.
The same thing.
Yeah.
Well, and that's partially because he wrote for every Man in the High Castle, every time out of joint. He wrote a Cosmic Puppets or
He had the E2.
yeah, Clans of the Alphane Moon, which I liked, but well, I kind of didn't.
Yeah.
That episode's coming out soon, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But he definitely played in both sandboxes, and I think that's part of one of the reasons why Dick, that happened to him. Brian, you've written post-apocalyptic fiction.
I have
one of my favorites of the last couple of years being Immobility. Was that book influenced by Canticle for Leibowitz? And do you think?
I don't know because I hadn't reread it when I wrote Immobility, but I think it may have been behind it in some ways. I mean, there's little moments that when I was rereading it, I thought about. Certainly, like the sensibility of it was something that was important to me. There's actually another book that I've been working on that I kind of put aside for a while, that I'm only realized after reading it that it was really influenced by Canticle for Leibowitz, that goes through different times and things like that. And, I think that's where I got it from.
Finish that book, Brian, because I want to read it.
My best.
Yeah.
I would say there's echoes of Canticle for Leibowitz and like the black humor and Immobility too.
Oh yeah, I think that's
whether it was intentional or not, but
yeah. It's definitely, we have a similar kind of sense of humor, I think. So that's probably the reason I liked it when I first read it. So yeah.
Yeah, and for any dickheads out there, if you haven't read Immobility, I think I compared it at the time to The Road meets THX 1138.
I think you recommend it highly.
Yeah, we're both big fans. But just to wrap up Canticle for Leibowitz, I'm going to read the book that he wrote. So the last thing that happened in Miller's life is that he started to write a sequel 35 years later. It was the first time he'd written anything in 35 years. And he wasn't able to finish it, but he left notes, and author Terry Bisson finished it. So it's out there. And I was at first kind of scared to read it because a lot of people said it just, it didn't live up to it. And I don't know. What do you guys feel? Are you do you want to leave it alone, or are you going to try to read it someday?
I'm going to start with the stories, and then I'll probably go on to that if the stories aren't too discouraging.
Yeah, the same. I'd be interested in taking a look at it maybe. But I've always kind of shied away from the non Frank Herbert Dune books, so it's I hate to sound bad like that, but just whenever an author's stuff gets finished by someone else, it makes me wary.
Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes there's special relationship that makes it work for the right author and the right project. But yeah, with the Dune books, I think Kevin J. Anderson, who dictates all of his books while walking on hikes, is not the person to be finishing Dune.
I'm just hoping you're just going to read it and let us know.
Yeah, I will probably read the sequel eventually, but I definitely think I gotta get down on those stories and see if there's a collection. But I want to read the Venus Plus X that was nominated the same year.
Yeah.
Because I think that one sounds really interesting. Theodore Sturgeon, of course, is really a great writer. So, Ian, where can people find you, or do you hide, or do you not want people to find you?
I actually don't really have social media much these days. But maybe I should get back into it. I kind of took a long detox from it for a while.
Well, at least writer, reader, Twitter is pretty good. But you're on Goodreads, aren't you?
What's that?
You're on Goodreads, aren't you, Ian?
Yes, that's right. Yes, of course. I am on Goodreads, totally. So you can totally look me up on Goodreads.
Yeah, Ian Duncanson on Goodreads. Yep. And because I think we're all readers here. So, and Ian reads good stuff, so I think you're a good follow on Goodreads. And Brian, you recently put out a short story collection, which you want to tell the folks about it? No.
It's a collection called Song for the Unraveling of the World. And it's kind of, I don't know, kind of grim stories, but funny stories, I suppose. I don't know how to describe it exactly.
I think it's very body themed. You got a lot of body stuff going on.
There it is. Excellent. There I am.
Right. Well, yeah, it is a really great collection. I think not to expand your head too much, but I think you're one of the best short story writers we got going in this day and age. And
no pressure.
But I think it's a really important work. And I've got a review up on my blog of Songs for the Unraveling of the World, and I really think it's definitely going to be in my top 10 this year. And this is a good year. This top 10 this year.
There's a lot of good stuff this year. I agree.
Yeah, between Cody Goodfellow's On America and James Reich's song "My Enemies Sing." Were two of my favorites, really great this year, and definitely ones that people should look out for. So I just really appreciate you guys joining me today. Is there anything last either one of you want to say about Canticle for Leibowitz? You've got the mic, Brian.
I think all I want to say is just read it. I think it's worth reading and checking out. We've been very careful not to give certain things away that are kind of amazing in the book, so.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing to people too, because I mean working in a library, even a lot of my fellow librarians and people in the field, I find they go, you get that old science fiction, and it tends to have this like some kind of like cringy racism or like homophobia or like it just seems really dated. But I would say this book does not really feel dated, and I would definitely recommend it. It still holds up.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, there's some certain books like I Am Legend, for example, doesn't seem dated at all when you read it. And then there's just the random mention of the nuclear war of 1976, and then you're like, whoa.
Little things like that don't bother me so much. But, sometimes some of the cringy stuff, I also, realize I'm reading books from, 50, 60 years ago at the same time. But, some of the cringy stuff makes me hesitate recommending it to everybody sometimes.
Yeah.
Totally. But, I think for the stuff that, if you stuck around and the stuff that we are carefully trying to avoid, I think that the themes in this are so strong that, it really comes through. There's nothing that really feels dated about it. I love Canticle for Leibowitz, and like I said, other than maybe Stand on Zanzibar, this is one of my favorite books of the 60s that I've read. So
awesome! I've got to go read Stand on Zanzibar.
Yeah, I've only read Sheep Look Up by him.
Really? Have you read any Bruner before, Brian?
I've read The Sheep Look Up, but that's it. I like that quite a bit.
Yeah.
Well, it's Stand on Zanzibar is definitely thematically connected to the Sheep Look Up, and I know most people consider Sheep Look Up, Stand on Zanzibar, and Shockwave Rider as like kind of his three masterpieces.
Mm-hmm.
And Shockwave Rider kind of predicts the internet, but you will be blown away by how much is prescient in Stand on Zanzibar. Trust me.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thanks, David.
All right. Hey, and thank you guys for joining us. I'm sorry about all the technological difficulties we had, but that's the theme of the book, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So thanks for joining us tonight, and Dickheads, keep it paranoid. Stay paranoid.